8 miles off the coast of Ireland, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, lie 2 small rocky islands called the Skelligs. The hour-long wave-tossed voyage in a small fishing boat was an adventure, to say the least. But soon we came upon the first and smaller of the 2 islands. This one, to the best of our knowledge, was never inhabited, at least not by human beings. It is, however, a wildlife sanctuary, and the sheer number of birds is staggering. After circling the smaller Skellig Island, it was time to move on to its big brother, Skellig Michael. After landing on Skellig Michael, we looked back at the smaller Skellig Island, much as the first monks probably did when they landed here in the 6th or 7th century. Seeking to turn this harsh island into a monastic retreat, the monks built these 600 stone steps into the mountainside, leading up to their new home in the cliffs, 500 feet above the sea. It would not be an easy life here. The Atlantic storms would batter the tiny island, and the rocky terrain afforded little soil for growing food. But these Christian holy men were purposely in search of a place set apart from the world. A place at one and the same time beautiful and austere. Over the first number of years, the monks would build a terrace into the jagged cliffs, supported by a massive retaining wall, creating a small patch of level ground on which to construct their stone huts and chapel. The monks employed indigenous Irish building techniques, creating these so-called beehive huts with mortarless, dry stone construction. There were probably no more than a dozen monks here at any one time, devoting themselves to a life of prayer and hard work, and they endured several Viking attacks. But undeterred, their monastic way of life continued for well over 500 years. Finally, in the 12th century, the Normans came to Ireland, and everything about Irish culture changed. The church took on more of its modern structure and began having much closer ties to Rome. These little remote island monasteries dedicated to prayer had become a thing of the past. And so the monks left Skellig Michael, settling into a monastery on the mainland. But their time here will not soon be forgotten.
We believe that sometime around the 6th or 7th centuries, a small handful of monks would have come out here. We don't know anything about them, but we do know that they wouldn't have been here. They wouldn't have had anything like this. You're on an artificial terrace. You'd be in the air here in the 6th century. The island comes down at an angle underneath you. And to make any kind of level surface, they had to build up that massive retaining wall that you walked through just now, coming in the entranceway, and level off and step up along the steps that you're sitting on to create a level ground for any kind of permanent dwelling. So it took a very long time to create any sort of permanent habitation here. And we see evidence underneath us and further down the mountainside of first attempts to establish a toehold here. And it might have taken generations of monks, maybe centuries, before the monastery began to look like this. So if you make it all disappear, you get more of an idea of what it looked like when they first came. They just had the inclined bedrock. They didn't have those steps you came up, of course. They didn't have any water. There's no spring on the island. They were very much up here just like the wild animals, just like the birds. And it was the kind of life they chose. They wanted to live in a wilderness environment. They looked for a difficult physical life away from society. And so there was a very strong ascetic impulse in the early Irish church. And the Irish weren't the first to live this way either. They were following very strong traditions which came all the way across the European world and had their beginnings in the first Christian monks, the people who lived in the deserts of Egypt or Syria or Palestine in the 3rd century, maybe about 200 years before these men got here, people like St. Anthony and St. Paul of the desert. And the reason I mention them is because the Irish monks knew about them. They would certainly have known about St. Anthony here. They might have even had a copy of his life here. He's a very strong role model in the early Irish church. This whole idea of going out to the Egyptian desert, living the life of a hermit, eating very little, denying yourself practically everything except just the bare minimum to survive, to live a life of prayer and solitude. And in some of the writings in Ireland, you see Ireland referred to as a little Egypt, or a vine transplanted out of Egypt. And this whole idea of going to the desert is very strong. You see place names in the west of Ireland even today which have the word desert in them, or desert. And originally they were little places set aside. So the desert wasn't necessarily sand, it was more a metaphor for just a life apart. And that's certainly what these men chose to do when they came out here. But gradually over time they began to consolidate their position. And the first time that we actually hear about them is the late 8th century. We have a document written in the year 798 from all the way over in Dublin, a monastery there in Tala. So we see the word Skellig written in the year 798. So Skelligs must have been well known by then. Certainly not long after that, Skelligs was known further afield because the Vikings came here. They came in the first half of the 9th century, maybe 3 times. And on one occasion, we know from one of the annals that they came here and they took away the abbot, the man in charge. His name was Eckau, and he was starved to death by the Vikings. So the Vikings obviously wreaked havoc here. But we do know that the monastery recovered relatively quickly. We have the name of an abbot here from only about 30 years later, and we have the name of 2 more abbots after that, one from the 10th century and one from the 11th century. And then our records stop. So our information is very, very sketchy, but we do have a time frame for when the monks were here. And we think they were here for 500 years anyhow, from about the 6th or 7th centuries up until the 12th. And that this was a focus for a small group of Christian ascetic monks, maybe no more than a dozen, living a very simple, difficult life, obviously, based on those monastic principles of prayer and devotion and work. And obviously they had to work quite hard to survive here. They lived as a community. They didn't live as hermits here at all. They lived in these cells around behind you. They would have come together into their oratory here, this large building, to pray communally together, maybe even have the mass said if one of them happened to be a priest. And they had to work to survive together here, just to build this, to farm, to fish, to make life go. The monastery, to a certain extent, revolves around this central core. This was the main oratory for the monks, and it was the holy center of the monastery, obviously, because it was where they went to talk to God. It was the house of God for them, so obviously special and revered and central. And you can see a few things about it yourself. First of all, it's built directly on top of this low-lying structure, this rectangular low structure here, which we call a liach. Basically, it's an altar shrine. And it's very ancient. It marks an old holy spot here, because the walls of that liach run underneath the oratory. So before the oratory was ever there, that was there, and you can see that for yourself. It is almost certainly a burial place or a place where relics were kept of someone early and important. Maybe someone as important indeed as the founder, or else someone early on who was central to the beginnings of this monastery. A great deal of the masonry that you see is original. Let's say 90% of it, at any rate, in the structures themselves. There's been a fair amount of conservation work over the centuries, of course. The tops of some of the cells, these 2 in particular, have had to be rebuilt at the very top. Some of the rubble has been cleared away, some of the structures have been kind of pushed together again. But if you go inside the cells, the inner core is almost in all cases original. And so we have it more or less intact. We have the oratory here where they worship together, and cisterns where they caught their water, garden terrace outside, the steps leading down to the sea, all in its natural environment, of course, relatively undisturbed, which makes it so different from the many sites ashore which would have been interfered with in the intervening centuries. But all of this way of life was coming to an end around the end of our period. In the 12th century, Ireland changed a lot. The Normans came to Ireland. They revolutionized society, and the church began to change a lot too, because you had the big monastic houses from Europe and England coming here, like the Benedictines, the Augustinians, the Cistercians, and they began to revolutionize the church. The church took on much more of its modern structure and began to have much closer ties to Rome. And the way of life of these little remote island monasteries dedicated to prayer really had become a thing of the past by then. And we know that the Augustinians came to Skellig. It's only about 12 miles from here, just around the coast here. We see ruins of their abbey still there. And sometime over the next century, and we don't know exactly how it happened, there was a shift ashore. These monks more or less deserted this place. And we don't know, did they die away or did they make a decision to leave? We know the weather was deteriorating in Ireland in the 12th century as well. So there was the shift ashore. After about the 13th century, this site is listed as belonging to the Augustinians in Skellig there. But of course it would have been seen as a holy place for 500 years by now. So it wasn't abandoned by any means. It would have been revered and seen as such. And the Augustinians used it. They built here. And they built this church. And if you look at it just for a second, you can see it's very, very different from everything else we have. It sticks out like a sore thumb. Everything else here is built of dry stone. They're the beehives or clachans. They're built in the native way of building the stone here in the west of Ireland. But this is very different. They even brought over stone to build this building. You'll notice this green stone facing the entranceway. It's the only stone in all the buildings that doesn't come from this island. And it's green sandstone from Valentia Island, just over across the water there. And they brought it because they could build these facing stones very neatly into their entranceway, the way they had done in other places ashore. So it shows a big change taking place here, but shows, of course, too, that the island was being used and revered mainly as a place of pilgrimage. It's a place where people began to come as pilgrims, and it developed into quite an important pilgrimage place. By the 15th, 16th centuries, letters to Rome indicate that it was one of the 2 or 3 more important penitential stations in Ireland. And this continued right up until relatively modern times, till 250 years ago.